Okay, good afternoon. I'm Lieutenant Commander Matt Driscoll. I'm the Operations Officer for Electronic Attack Squadron 129 at Whidbey Island Naval Air Station, Whidbey Island, Washington. Today, we are here to talk about global war on terrorism. This is the Milken Global Conference's first ever panel featuring a topic with a purely military perspective, especially in a topic of very much of global importance. I've been to 6 global conferences, and this is sort of an area where Mike Clouden and I felt was missing from your global conference experience and the conversation here. So we set about to change that. With the senior advisor at the Milken Institute named Travis Dredd, who I need to thank publicly and give a lot of credit to, we sort of pushed some of these military and veterans issues into the conversation this year. This is our second public panel. We had 1 private panel. And we also, sitting amongst you, we have 7 different military officers from various branches that are part of the Milken Institute's Military Leadership Circle. That's a program which the Milken Institute generously funded and supported to make sure that there were other officers that could have the same experience I had had at this conference, to bring their voice, but also to bring them to the table to learn and make our military better. So today we're going to talk about the long war on terrorism, and the real all-stars are to my right and left. They are a very diverse group of current and former military officers. They're going to discuss their perspectives. They're going to talk about strategy and policy and decision-making, hopefully providing you an inside view from the 30,000-foot level. And they're going to go all the way down to an operator's perspective of things they've seen in the field that have worked and don't work, and how those experiences have shaped them when they've been at the tip of the spear in this conflict. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists from left to right. Their bios are distinguished, so I'll keep it brief so that you can hear their voices more importantly. First, to my left is Brigadier General John Daniel, He is a career infantry officer, and he currently serves as the Assistant Division Commander for 1st Marine Division, Camp Pendleton, California. He's commanded the platoon, the company, the battalion, the regimental, the brigade, and now the Marine Expeditionary Force levels. He has experience at the service, component, the joint, the combined, the coalition levels, as well as coalition headquarters levels in this conflict. As a general officer, most recently, some of his recent posts include the Commanding General of Marine Corps Recruiting Depot, San Diego Western Division, and Western Recruiting Region. He's been the Commanding General for the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force Forward, and most recently the Commanding General of Marine Expeditionary Brigade, Afghanistan, as well as the Commander of Regional Command from January to November of 2014. He has several master's degrees, and he's a permanent member on the Council on Foreign Relations as well. Or excuse me, he was also a fellow at one point at Council on Foreign Relations for the Commandant of the Marine Corps. In addition to that, in his spare time, no big deal, he's a Marine combatant diver, a military free-fall parachutist, and a graduate of the Army Ranger School. So anything you can do, he can probably do better. The John on our panel is to our far right, That's Lieutenant Colonel John Gallagher. John's a graduate of West Point. He initially started in the infantry and then went on to be an Army strategist. As an Army strategist, he came back to West Point to teach in national security policy, political philosophy, and counterterrorism. And after that, his career sort of took off. He began advising various generals in different situations and different commands. Several included, he was a special assistant to the commander of the U.S. Central Command, traveling throughout the Middle East during the Arab Spring. He then went to be an advisor for the commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010, so we've seen that war up close and personal. And he currently serves as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey. John's also a writer and a scholar as well. Last, certainly not least, is retired Brigadier General Kimberly Field. She also started at West Point. First started in the military as a military police, and then quickly moved on to be an Army strategist as well. She's done 5 operational tours. She's also done 2 tours with the State Department, including the Chief of Plans and Analysis at the George C. Marshall Center. She has taught at West Point. She's been the executive officer to the commander in Afghanistan, and sort of her specialty is having a long history of working in stabilization operations as well as in her last job, she was also the Pentagon's Joint Staff Deputy Director for Middle East Political Affairs, who also advised the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So as you can see, a distinguished group of experts with a broad set of experiences, both at the strategy, at the policy, and the operational levels. So to frame this debate, we're going to start with just sort of a series of questions. And when we go into a conflict, we always talk about rules of engagement. So I'll give you just briefly our rules of engagement here. I'm going to pose a series of questions to bring out sort of the experiences and expertise of our panelists, but we want to make this interactive. So after I go through and give them a few minutes to respond, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll take probably 2 questions after each wave of responses before we move on to another question. And at the end, we'll open it up for general questions. I think someone is running around here with a microphone, so they'll get to you quickly, so hopefully your hand won't get too tired. So let's sort of start with a general set of questions, because the thing that's sort of on my mind here is about the problem of terrorism and why it's really still a problem. Why is it a topic we're talking about 14 years after 9/11, conflicts in 2 nations that spanned a decade or more? So what I want to know is, why is the problem of terrorism not a problem of the past? Why haven't we had more success with this problem? Why essentially we're fighting the same conflict but with a different enemy potentially? And what I want to know also, and maybe others in the room, as a father of a toddler, is my daughter going to be fighting this war in her generation when she's of age to be in the military one day? General Phil?
Probably. You know, the short answer is it's very difficult. These are the most complex of problems. The U.S. Central Command Commander has said that, for example, the problem in Syria right now is the most complex problem he has seen in almost 40 years of service. And they started hard. And they start in situations like when I was a company commander, a captain in Somalia, in environments, largely, not all, but in environments that are unstable, or there's disenfranchised populations, or there's failures of governance. So they started hard in tough situations. We learned in Afghanistan, we've learned in Iraq, and the enemy learns too. So while we are very good in the military at decisive battles, at winning decisive battles, we know loud and clear now that the answer or the resolution of these problems takes all government agencies, all of us working together. We're all learning, but as I said, as we learn, the enemy learns too. And it's really getting harder. And we can talk a little bit if you're interested, and maybe one of my fellow panelists would like to talk about the differences in the enemy between the last 10 years and the one we're facing today.
Thank you. General Yu, why are we still fighting this war?
Well, first off, you had the hardest job as the introduction. You did a great job. And I get confused with John Yu a lot because he's a pretty prolific writer and an attorney, most noted during the Bush administration. To answer your question, I think terrorism is going to be around for many generations. It's been around as long as there's been a history of conflict. It's been challenging. I think when you look at terrorism in the context of the larger global challenges, I think you'll see a landscape that is somewhat complex, still volatile in some areas. Instability will be present in many areas as well, too. And it is going to be balanced out with the competition for national resources, natural disasters, regional conflicts and competition, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and small groups that are disaffected, that are looking for a change in their lives. And it's probably no different than what we see domestically here sometimes as well, too. If you look at the riots that are going on in Baltimore, and you put that in a context of an organization that we've seen morph between what originally we were dealing with AQAI initially, and then it expanded to what we see in ISIL, which is really a pseudo-state organization. It's a geopolitical entity that has all the trappings that you would associate it with independent state, except for the recognition there. So I think it's a challenge that we're going to see in the near future, and one that we're going to have to apply resources. But when I say we, it's not the military. This is a military panel, but the problem, just like many of the other problems we deal with as a society and as a leader in the world, it's a whole of government, but really a whole of international government. And those countries that are most affected by a certain aspect of terrorism, like in the Middle East, they have to be taking the lead and have the lion's share of the responsibility in order to defeat.
So Lieutenant Colonel Gallagher, I'll pose the question to you, but may even ask you to address it. So we call it the global war on terrorism, but also based on your expertise and some of your training, is that the right term to be used? And why are we fighting this? Is it extremism? Is it religious extremism? Is it violent religious extremism, as Tony Blair was talking about, and all those different nuanced terms? You know, why are we still fighting, and who's our enemy in this struggle?
Thanks, Matt. Let me just take a moment to say that based on where I work at the Pentagon, I've got to make clear that the perspective that I'm offering today is my own. I'm not here speaking on behalf of DOD. Matt mentioned I had an opportunity to teach some of these topics at West Point and work for some really great military leaders. I also had a chance to work in both the Bush and Obama administrations on the National Security Council. Like General Field has also worked at the State Department, so we've been able to take the uniform off a little bit and see policy formation and then how it is operationalized in the field. So I'm going to do my best to leverage some of those perspectives, but again, these comments are entirely my own. You've heard already that this threat is extremely complex. This enemy is adaptive and resilient. We too have been adaptive and resilient. But let me just take a minute to answer your question, Matt, and say a little bit about the enemy, which I think we'll get at the answer, and a little bit about us. What we've really learned that this enemy, properly understood, these are loosely networked non-state actors inspired by some manifestation of Salafi extremism. They have access to unprecedented levels of information, communications, mobility within and across states, money flow, and disproportionate violent means. They consolidate territorially in places that are advantageous to them. We and host nation governments apply pressure to those areas. We find that one of the dominant attributes of this threat is its ability to migrate to areas of weak and corrupt governance, weave its ideo-religious narrative into local grievances to recruit and expand. And those who do not support this often brutally intolerant worldview, whether it's governments, people, or statues that do not align, need to be toppled, converted, or smashed. And conveniently, the worldview has some non-falsifiable claims of rewards in the afterlife if you die in this struggle. And it makes them very coercion resistant, and it helps to explain some of this adaptability and resilience. If you look at the way that we have, in my view, approached this threat over the last 14 years, you could argue that maybe we placed a little bit too much emphasis on this enemy's sort of territory. You know, the doctrine of no safe haven, disrupt, dismantle, defeat in Afghanistan and Pakistan, that will surely, we said, put this threat on the path to strategic defeat. And we're learning now as these groups expand that there isn't such a tie to territory, or at least their ability to sort of move into different places is it's outpacing our expectations. Additionally, the disrupt, dismantle, defeat approach does not account for the important role of delegitimization. And if you don't delegitimize the worldview, something we can't exactly do, but we can partner with constructive religious voices in the region who can, you may find yourself disrupting, dismantling, and defeating through a series of tactical and operational interdictions nearly forever. We made, I think, some assumptions that the ideology itself is bankrupt, it doesn't resonate, confirmed with Osama bin Laden's death and the Arab Spring and a whole host of other things. And now we're confronted with the emergence of ISIL. And if you've read Seth Jones' great article in RAND where he talks about some, I think it's 3 groups, Salafi jihadist groups in 1988, 19 groups on 9/11, and now we have 49 active groups of this type. There's an expansion. Our predictions on the trajectory of this threat and the resonance of this worldview, in many ways, I think were you could say, quite wrong over the last 12 years. And finally, I'll say we have had such a strong us versus them bias in the approach. Certainly, you want to protect the nation and protect our partners and our forces against these threats. But if you'll allow me to end these comments with an analogy, if I threw a red ping pong ball in the corner of the room, and that represented the militants, the violent extremists, and I filled the rest of the room with white ping pong balls. You could say this is the ratio between destructive and constructive voices. And for a time, our approach to CT, overlooking the countering violent extremism piece, has been to crash into the room through the white ping pong balls looking for the red. And there is an important element of military force in that. But I think now we're starting to learn how important it is to leverage the relationship we have with the white ping pong balls in the room and their connection to one another through information sharing and social media. And through this, there is a way to not only, I think, physically overwhelm the threat, but also to ideologically counter the threat with constructive voices. And I think we're right now in this period of a paradigm shift. It's been 14 years, but this complex a problem, it's going to take a long time for us to really approach it in a way that will put it on the path that we thought it was on all these years.
Well, great. None of you made me feel any better about your answers and where we're going necessarily. So are there any questions before we move on to your experiences from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I just have a quick comment. I'm Yasmin Shahata from Egypt. You have a very distinguished panel, but I really think part of the problem, especially in the US point of view, you should have some Arab people on the panel. You should understand the solution to this terrorism is not going to be, it's not going to succeed through military force. You know, that's a temporary thing, and it just leads to more frustration, more anger, and more potential terrorists. So I just want to ask the panel, through their experience, because they've probably seen war and the horrible consequences of war more than most Americans, don't you get it by now that you really need to reach out and understand what causes people to think that their lives are so worthless that they'd rather die for a cause than live?
I think that's an excellent question. And I actually think most of the panelists will, if not all, will agree with you, and we'd get to that. So who would like to, General, would you like to take that? General Field or General Yu first?
Some of it has to do with ideology and beliefs in order to change the perspective. Some of it has to do with nationalistic views as well, too. I think it's a challenge, again, in the ungoverned spaces, it's very susceptible for terrorism to come forth or insurgency to start. But in the governed spaces, it's about the rule of law and providing essential services and those things that the public expect of a government, a sovereign government. And from the perspective of the military, we realize it's not a military problem. And we're one element of the solution. You get a lot of media based on our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as a result of 9/11. But I think for a long time, we'll realize it's really about governance and all the other things. Security will only provide the foundation of stability, but long-term stability is really based on governance and all those pillars associated with governance.
Jennifer?
I actually couldn't agree with you more. And I remember having the conversations with the commander in Afghanistan and saying, if we, without setting a better context, having a better awareness of the environment and what the people really want and really need and what their grievances are, and we kill one, we will create 10. We will create 10 of their brothers, cousins. You know, there will be more of them. And in fact, I think we saw that happen. Again, we are learning and we are doing things very differently. So now, for example, in Iraq, we will have a partner on the ground or we won't do this. And why is that? Because we know that our partners on the ground, our Iraqi partners on the ground, Sunni, Shia, Kurds, know what they need, know what they can abide, know what they can provide in a much more reasonable, feasible way in order to achieve mutual objectives. So I think we're less heavy-handed. The military certainly is used to create space, we say. It's not a great phrase. You know, create space for local governance and the people to determine their own future. That's the goal. We're still going to make mistakes. We're still going to learn. The option to do nothing is simply not an option that America can take for many reasons. Political, security. We're partners with the states in the Middle East. We have obligations to where we can, uphold international norms and international law. So for America, the option to do nothing is simply not there.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. So your question is right on, and in some ways it's part of what I tried to describe, and that is if you only focus on sort of the us versus them, and the them are those who do violence, that's not a comprehensive approach. So I want to acknowledge that. I think it's important, though, to recognize that there is a painstakingly woven worldview or ideology that goes far left of ISIS or al-Qaeda, Ibn Taymiyyah in the 13th century, the Muslim Brotherhood's sort of violent worldview in the first third of the last century, combining with Wahhabism in the 60s. And ISIL is a modern application or adaptation of a lot of those same sort of beliefs and sentiments. And yes, I agree, these are individuals who see their lives in a way that it doesn't place enough value on their own lives, and they want to participate in this. But understand that it is a worldview that is at least making the claim that if you participate in this movement, you're taking part in something that is courageous, and it's noble, and it's a cause that will bring a benefit to groups that you care about. There are benefits that accrue to you, like pay and camaraderie and friendship and adventure, and there's a certain degree of social standing you enjoy because you've won this battle within yourself to step forward and strive. There's a story there that is inspiring people, and our ability to counter it is extremely limited. But there are people all throughout the region, I'm talking about millions upon millions of Muslims, who these extremists hide among, indoctrinate, terrorize, and attempt to kill, who have long been calling us into a role of support, but not such a heavy-handed role that we intensify the problem. We don't want to scratch poison ivy, if you will, pursuing every group and every safe haven, only to see it spread, as General Field has said. So we're trying to be more sophisticated in this approach, listen more, and partner with the majority.
And I want to say one thing before I move on to another question. I want to agree with you in that this is only a first step to bring this conversation to Milken. And so next year, and hopefully you can provide this on some feedback, I think they all send conference evaluations to all of you, that we would like to include more people from diverse military experiences and cultures here on a panel like that to talk about an issue of global importance. And also, if you haven't gotten the sense from what everyone talked about here, this is not necessarily to glorify the use by any means of the military. It's simply to sometimes explain how the military can be used. And coming here for 6 years, what I realize is there's often a disconnect between this crowd and the bubble that all of us either do live in or have lived in. And so it's simply to give you a window into the world of how the military sometimes thinks or can deal with these problems, not that it always should be the one that deals with those problems. Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm gonna give him a shot real quick. Next round.
David Solomon, Nation Building Collective in Africa. For the past 3 years, we've been looking at countermeasures strategically within the region from an economic perspective. I'm a Jewish man. I sat down with Queen Rania not long ago, and I said we faced a common threat, and we need common solutions. In 1973, Israel employed Nahal, which I think you're familiar with, which is combined agriculture and military training. And it prevented Jordan from joining the war at the time against Israel. And the reason I'm bringing this up, and it is a question to which I pose to you, which I want to hear your thoughts. Should we not be deploying these kind of things along the border, agriculture, as a legitimate means of securing the borders and also giving people life opportunity and purpose, economic purpose, whilst at the same time allowing them to defend their regions if they do get attacked?
General Field, would you like to start, or
Yeah, sure. I think we try. I think our failure really in deploying these different tools to get at the longer-term problems is a failure probably to prioritize and order, synchronize our activities. I think that's one reason. Secondly, I think it's very difficult. It's difficult to deploy these kinds of instruments of national power in insecure areas. You can find local partners, of course, But even to grab a foothold, it's been difficult, very difficult in Syria. We really can't go in, right? You're saying across the border, maybe where there's refugee flow, and I think we do. I mean, you're very familiar with the camps. Those are long-term solutions that are absolutely critical. The military typically will operate in the crisis space first. And so again, I come back to this idea of prioritizing and synchronizing and determining the order of things. But I don't disagree.
So because our panel has a broad set of military and even some experiences in dealing with the civilian sector, I want to bring out some of those experiences because I want to personalize the conversation a little bit about what they've seen, whether it's in the air or on the ground in this conflict. So General, if you would start, talk to us a little bit about what are some of your most memorable experiences in dealing with the war on terrorism? What has really shaped some of your views about this conflict? And you could even tell that through the eyes of some of your soldiers and Marines, if you'd like as well.
Before I start, I just want to touch upon, ISIL is somewhat different phenomenon than we've seen over the last 14 years in the fight against terrorism. When you talk about foreign fighters that go back and forth, that's about 30% of their 30,000 man army that they have, person army over there, foreign fighters. Majority of those are Sunnis that were not happy with what was happening with the Iraqi government, and it caused that. And so when you look at the success we had as far as dismantling and destroying the AQ network, 75% of the leaders we have destroyed over the last 14 years. So I think the counterterrorism strategy that we had has been effective to a large extent, but just like the enemy is adapting and evolving, we need to do the same, and I think we're doing that as a whole government approach. But the ISIL problem is much larger than the United States, and I think it's somewhat rewarding because when you ask me about my experiences in Afghanistan, one could compare it to the success we're having right now. Who would have thought all the foreign military sales and the relationship we had with Saudi Arabia, which not at all time, throughout the history has not always been perfect with our policy, are leading strikes into Yemen and those things and taking responsibility for their region there. When you talk about Afghanistan, you could talk whether it was a success when we went in there 9/11 and then we kind of got distracted. I mean, there's all kinds of different views out there. I personally, from my experiences, think Afghanistan is very successful. And what we've experienced on my last rotation, as we transitioned the NATO mission to Resolute Support, which still has a CT mission associated with that under Freedom Sentinel, which is the U.S. portion of it, we saw an organization, an Afghan National Army, that had no presence down in the Southwest to where they were a viable force that was capable and still establishing credibility through the course of the time I was there between the elections and taking not just lead security responsibility, but full security responsibility as we pulled out U.S. and coalition forces in November of this past year. And so when you look about the strategy that we had in Afghanistan, and you talk about population-centric coin, really we needed to focus on the capabilities of the internal Afghan government, not just the security forces, but those other pillars which were not just government, but international, and not just military, but the whole of government and international contributions to the success of those, especially when you talk about governance, peace, and development. But from a military perspective, we were very, very successful in force generating a capable force. I think we were also very successful in understanding that it really isn't going to be the Afghan National Army that's going to maintain stability. It's got to be all the elements of their national security force, primarily the police, the ones that live with the locals on a daily basis, in order to maintain security for the local populace and provide the environment for social services to get down there. The issue that you see right now in the Afghan problem, and just like a lot of the insurgencies that we've had over the history, is the issue of sanctuary and state-sponsored terrorism that continues to come across the borders, whether it's from Pakistan or Iran, and the sanctuary of the terrorists to be able to go through there. And when you talk about terrorists in Afghan perspective, everyone says Taliban. Well, Taliban is a general descriptor. It's specific to a certain organization, but you have Haqqani, you have Hezbollah, you have foreign fighters. And so when you read in the paper about the coalition is pulled out, the Taliban is back. The Taliban never left. They were part of the Afghan culture there. And the true test will be whether the Afghans themselves, from governance to development to security, can have some kind of reconciliation and reintegration of those disaffected organizations and individuals. And all counterinsurgencies end with a political settlement. And I'm optimistic, based on the leadership that, the international leadership that's out there and the success we've seen most recently, that Afghanistan is continuing to move in the right direction.
Thank you, General. General Field?
So I've operated, when we talk about how we operate in the military and the capabilities we bring to bear, we talk about the tactical level where we create effects. And hopefully we'll see some of those cool naval air videos that we have there that you can really see what the incredible power of the U.S. military and what we can do precisely and with tremendous lethality. We've talked a lot about not being very lethal, but we are tremendously lethal. We talk about tactically what we can do. And we talk about operationally where we make a very detailed plan to bring together all the different service contributions, the naval air, the Army on the ground training other forces, obviously the Air Force and all that they're doing in Iraq, for example. The Marines, I don't know what they do. And then we talk about the strategic level and the policy making. And frankly, I've operated at all three. If we do see some clips of what we can do kinetically, I'll show you a few pictures of what we can do with drinking tea, on the ground with some of our partners, in this case in Afghanistan. Recently, however, what I have done is on the Joint Staff with John, and Yemen is all over the news. I think everybody knows that. Yemen was what the president called a successful model for prosecuting this long war. It was heavy on intelligence, heavy on special operating forces on the ground with precision capability. It was heavy on developing the capability of the Yemeni security forces and the Yemeni forces writ large. And in fact, we were degrading the capability of the most serious threat to the homeland, AQAP, which is in Yemen. It is not ISIL. It's gaining, but it's AQAP in Yemen. That obviously has fallen off the tracks. Now, why is that? Why is this stuff so hard? What I would do personally is say, hey, this is only a short-term solution. Killing al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, yes, we must do it in the short term, but what else are we doing in Yemen to what we used to call bolster Hadi, President Hadi, right? Where there's a good leader, good institutions can follow, but typically in these situations, you have to have good leaders. Maybe it's the same way in corporations, it's the same way, particularly at inflection points. So we had a decent leader in President Hadi. And I've personally spent a lot of my time running around and saying to the special operators, if you guys talk about the need for building a greater, more stability in the context, people will listen. They're not gonna listen to me, right? Because I don't carry big guns, and I used to. I want to make that clear. Okay. And I have 4 teenage sons, which is harder than anything. So, and the soft guys would say, absolutely, this is just a short term, we need a greater context. And I'd run over to the State Department. And when the president asked for, and we sit in these interagency meetings, and he asked for options to bolster President Hadi, and every agency comes up with their list. We came up with our list in the Department of Defense, which frankly was more than specifically killing al-Qaeda with our, what we call operations intelligence fusion, our operations. I won't give you what that list was, but I personally spent a lot of my time doing that. Obviously we have to measure our success sometimes by the amount of energy we put into things and not the outcomes that we achieve, because we were a little late. We were a little late, and why were we a little bit late with Yemen? We knew it was a dangerous threat, but what was happening at the same time in the Middle East? We have this red swath of ISIL coming through Syria and into Iraq. And I'll tell you, in Washington, bandwidth, it just gets sucked up very quickly on one problem, never mind all of them. So it still took priority. And I think we were a little slow with regard to Yemen.
And we probably will continue that conversation with Yemen if we get to it in just a minute. Senator Gallagher, you were there during the Arab Spring. You were on the ground in Afghanistan as an advisor, and then you moved over advising the chairman. So you've seen it on the ground. You've seen it behind closed doors in these meetings. What stands out to you among your experiences, both operationally and in sort of the role of a strategist?
Well, let me build on what General Yu said just a little bit about Afghanistan. The level of partnership and sacrifice and selflessness on both the coalition and Afghan side of the aisle is really something inspiring if you see it up close. We had an opportunity working for the commanders there. We had an opportunity to meet with the senior-most members of Afghan society, to include those who have gone on to lead Afghanistan now. And some of these leaders said to us, the debt that we will always feel toward the coalition, the United States, toward ISAF for what you've done for us is forever. You have freed us from the constraints of our geography in developing a road network. You have given us an Afghan national security force that we are proud of, that Afghan citizens actually applaud as they sort of move through some of these towns and villages. This senior individual described the travel time between one Afghan city and Kabul for medical treatment was so much that in some cases, he said, pregnant women on these roads that were nearly untrafficable would lose their babies at times, and now they're able to get the treatment quickly and safely proceed into the capital. He described this as a foundation for the future that includes a fully sovereign Afghanistan and a partnership. This is all the positive stuff. There are challenges ahead, but when you sit with, for example, a deputy minister in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who came from a very prestigious British university to take this position, and he left Afghanistan when he was 11 years old. He invited Karzai to speak at this university, and Karzai said, do you want to come and work with me? And he did. And we were sitting once at his house, and he described how he and a friend of his were trying to expand broadband satellite access for all Afghans, just had 2 of their employees kidnapped, and one of them was killed, and they were bargaining with the other one. And this individual was nearly in tears, and he was saying, I don't know what to do. I came back to help my country. I'm working with this guy to help give them access to real-time communications and sort of change the future. And yet our people are being preyed upon, and one of them is now dead. And in a little bit of twist of levity, I guess, he said, if you are willing to overlook General Order Number 1, which is no alcohol in theater, I would be willing to set aside some of my religious restrictions. And I'd like to introduce to you my friend Balak Labal. And I said, who's Balak Labal? That's how he pronounced Johnny Walker Black Label Scotch. So he pulled out a bottle of scotch. I won't tell you what happened next, but it's one of these endearing moments where the severity of this situation combines with sort of the very personal aspects of it. It's been very meaningful to me to sort of see that.
It's a great story. Real quick, are there any questions on some of these personal experiences before we go on to and shift gears a bit? Yes, ma'am. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, please feel free to direct it directly to them.
I think there's a lot of fatigue internationally and obviously in the U.S. about not just this conflict, but this general engagement. How do you think that the humanity has gotten lost in this process? Because what you're talking about is kind of that human connection. And if you could hear those stories and you could hear about people saying, you know, we will forever be in debt to you, I think that around the world and certainly within the U.S., there'd probably be a renewed sense of commitment to making sure that we get this done right.
Yeah.
Good question.
That's one of the great challenges. This type of conflict resists progress, first of all. It's so complex. It's nonlinear. It resists even sort of the measurement of, you know, General Field talked about inputs and outputs and outcomes. You can report progress on inputs. We're training Afghan soldiers. Well, outputs mean they graduate and can do in the field what we trained them to do. And outcomes are, can they secure people and people behave differently when they're secured? And can those outcomes persist when the inputs stop? which part of that do you actually report back on? There are some people who listen for data in terms of progress. There are others who listen for human stories about girls. I saw one with a Dora backpack as I was in Afghanistan, missing the entire first year of my third daughter's life. And there I see this little girl with a Dora backpack walking to school, something she couldn't do. So there are multiple sort of channels that communicate either progress or the humanity, and it's really just hard to capture it all, because although I told a very positive side of this story, there is a whole lot of loss and human suffering and a lot of resources, whether financial, human, even political, that have been invested in Afghanistan, and some of the outputs and outcomes have not kept pace with those inputs. And there's a very, there are very real costs that cause us to pause and say, how much longer can we continue with the heavy level of investments if we don't see either the ownership or the outputs that we sought? So there's I don't want to say noise, but there are a lot of channels of communication, and the humanity part of it doesn't always rise to the top.
That's a great segue. I want to see, are there any other questions? But otherwise, I'm going to shift gears. Yes, sir, in the back.
First of all, thank you very much for being here, and thank you all for your service. And, you obviously represent our nation incredibly well, and at least for me, make me very proud. So again, thank you. I want to ask you about Syria. When we talk about our successes in Afghanistan, and you can kind of see at least a direction and an end game in Iraq if everything goes well. Syria just seems like such a mess. And when we have our ongoing airstrikes in Syria, I'm wondering if you could comment on tactically with the type of weapons and aircraft we're using there, and then also sort of politically, like how do we choose our targets there now that the immediate sort of humanitarian crisis in Kobani is over? And when we do, kind of who are we helping? Because in some cases the vacuum is filled by a Sunni extremist group. In some cases it's vacuums filled by the current government backed by Iran. So it doesn't look like we have any friends or end game anywhere there. So I wonder if you could comment on those.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm going to go to General Field and ask her to sort of address who's the enemy in Syria.
The strategy with regard to ISIL is to degrade and destroy it, largely in phases. The degrade phase initially was suggested as 3 years, just to degrade, right? Not even to destroy. To destroy, this problem started in Syria, and it probably has to end in Syria. U.S. policy has been pretty clear. Assad is not someone we want to work with. He really shouldn't be in power. However, again, it's all about sequencing. So how do you pick targets in Iraq and targets in Syria and have this be a coherent strategy? It's really hard. The Iraq portion is clear. We do have a partner on the ground. We have a government we can work with. We largely will take some of our, you asked about the target acquisition, how do we know which targets to acquire? In the case of Iraq, we work with the Iraqi government and the Iraqi security forces, and they have both an operational plan as well as more of a political plan. Which is first? Is it Tikrit? Is it Mosul? Is it Anbar? Where should we enable with our air power largely and our training of ground forces to help them? And they nominate and help us with those targets. However, there's places like Kobani. And you say, why Kobani? But did that make any sense? Well, we balance a lot of things in these missions. Frankly, my opinion, the best foreign policy is one that combines our values with our interests. And in this case, there could be a case made for maybe not as much interest, but more values because of the humanitarian crisis. So we have a strong population in Washington that wants to prevent mass atrocities as simply the right thing to do. So in part, Kobani was in part that. Same thing with Mount Sinjar. Remember that about a year ago now, was it, John? Not quite. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Same thing there. You say, what was the strategic value of that mountaintop? It does have a bit of strategic value, but mostly it was to save that population on the top. It was about to, we won't use the word genocide, right? But it was about to be wiped out. So how we acquire these targets, there's various reasons. heading into Syria, it's harder. We have to be careful right now in this phase of the campaign that we're not helping the wrong people. And that's really hard when you think about why, if we're looking for a partner on the ground in Syria, and those partners on the ground are really most interested in Assad going away. But think about this, right? We also have the Assad regime backed by Iran. We're in the middle of major diplomacy with Iran right now, right? So there's all kinds of things that come into this mix. We don't know how this will unfold yet. We're going to take it, in this case, being a strategist, John and I, we don't like not having the end state, knowing exactly where we're going. But in this case, we're going to take it one step at a time and see how it unfolds. Thanks for those questions.
We have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm just going to ask maybe General Yu or Lieutenant Colonel Gallagher just to touch on this briefly, and then we'll open up just the last couple minutes for questions. So we're here to talk about the global war on terror, but there's a lot of priorities, right? And we have shrinking resources. So we talk about other priorities for global security and U.S. foreign policy with the military as an instrument, potential instrument or means of power. You talk about Ukraine and Russia, for example, or you have the pivot to the Pacific. And we're dealing with sort of balancing that with the global war on terror and other things all at the same time, while NATO budgets are shrinking, the military is dealing with sequestration. So I think, especially from a business standpoint that you may have experienced, a strategic standpoint, how basically do we use the military as an effective means or instrument of power while we're dealing with essentially the battle for shrinking resources here at home and amongst our allies? I mean, how can we be more efficient and effective when the military is being used and deployed as an instrument of power? And what are the challenges with that?
I think at the end of the day, just like many of you in the private sector, it gets back to ends, ways, and means. And for us, the ends, we have a national security strategy with 4 lofty goals. We want to be able to secure our nation and our national interests. We want to make sure that we have prosperity economically, our values, which mean a lot to us. And then we want an international order. And so when you look at that, and the question gets back to, my response gets back to Afghanistan, why we were there. We were there for a reason. It was in our national interest. Some would argue it's not vital. We could have that discussion here, but I personally think it is in our national interest to have a stable, integrated Afghanistan. Getting back to the diminishing resources, the topic today is counterterrorism or the war on terror, which leads you to counterterrorism. But there's a lot of stuff you do to including counterterrorism that are left of the boom. And we want to go and engage and build partnership capacity in those areas that we think are important, not just for us, but our allies and our partners and all the bilateral agreements we have. If we don't go into Africa and make sure they have stable governance and they can provide essential services, the humanitarian or the medical fallout that could cause us would cost the international community much more on the back end. And so when you talk about ends, ways, and means, and everyone looks at the Department of Defense with I think the president just put forward a $608 billion budget for FY16, which is significant when you talk about non-discretionary funds and how much of that it encompasses. There's no shortage of work for the military, not just from the high-end boots on the ground, but for the forward presence, the deterrence, the partnership capacity building, all those things that we do to enable diplomacy from the perspective. And so we've talked a lot about terrorism here, but there are a lot of challenges. If you look at what's going on, who would have thought 3 years ago the situation in Ukraine right now and a resurgence of Russia? We knew China was always going to be on the rise economically. None of us thought they would be a peer competitor militarily, and probably still is not. But economically, and the influence they have on the international community is pretty significant. And so it's a challenge from a military perspective on balancing where we send our forces, whether it's for crisis response or whether it's for deployments and partnership capacity building and helping diplomacy. I think as you look at where we are today, as I said in my opening statement, I think the future, because we're so globally connected, because of the social media and the threats to cyber, we used to worry about 3 domains that expanded to 4 domains, from the continental domain the air domain, the sea domain, and then we talked about space. We got cyber now as well, too. And so when you look at the resources and making sure that we can underwrite all those tenets in our national security strategy is important for our prosperity as a nation and our responsibility as a global leader. I think the military is a huge part of that. And we're going through some tough decisions right now. As the Overseas Contingency Fund budget comes down, the Budget Control Act and sequestration, and just like all of you, I think in my time in the Marine Corps, we have the best military I've seen, all volunteer force. And I think any organization, if you devalue your human capital, the cultivation of those individuals, and the experience we have right now over the last 14 years, I think it's the demise of your organization. And so we're challenged with that, especially my services. When you look at our portion of the resources, 65 cents of every dollar goes to paying allowances and entitlements. And then you have to balance modernization, operational maintenance, and all those things for infrastructure costs, the things that you deal with on a daily basis. So when you talk about resources and where you apply the military, it all gets back to what's important to the nation, what we are directed to do, and how we can influence the global environment. And it's got to be not just by ourselves, but it's got to be with our allies out there as well, too.
All right, unfortunately, they're going to probably kick us out of this room. Are there any other questions that I could get to really, really quickly? And we'll continue the conversation afterwards. Yes, sir, right there. Real quickly.
Just a quick question. What worries you most at night?
Quick answers.
I'll say big picture. What worries me most at night is that in our efforts to engage and lead in all of the areas that the General just described, sustainable U.S. leadership, bolstering international order, partnering with those who can help us as we undergo this sort of fiscal correction. As we attempt to do all of that, should we, in my view, the United States fall below a certain threshold of our ability to sort of assure our allies, deter our adversaries, form those partnerships, and maintain those military capabilities over the threats that we face, if we fall below a certain threshold, our ability to get it back or our ability to restore the order that we are presently able to support, I think if you believe the global security environment is unstable and unpredictable now, it will only get worse and worse if we don't weave all those things together to sort of sustain and even improve our ability to engage this uncertain world. I'm worried if we fall below where we are even now.
Shrinking resources. All right, on that note, thank you for your attention, your attentiveness. If you have questions, you're welcome to approach and continue this conversation afterwards. Thank you again.